Maseches Nedarim Daf Yud Beis deals completely with a question that was asked at the end of the last daf by Rami Bar Chama. The Gemara is going to try a number of different ways to find an answer to the question, to prove an answer. The Gemara will not successfully prove it, and the Gemara at the end will try to say that it's actually a machlokes tanoim. Now, before we study the question, it's important to keep something in mind. We're in the sugya of matfis, which is that somebody makes a neder declaring that something, his own food, someone else's food, is usher to him. He makes a neder creating that isser, and the way he does that is by linking it to something else which is usher and saying that this food, which should have been heter, is now becoming usher to me like that other isser. That only works if he's linking it to something which is usher because of a neder. That is something which is generally heter, and then somebody makes a neder to aser it, like a carbon. If he says it's a carbon is something which somebody was noider. He said this, I'm going to give this animal as a carbon. That's a neder. You cannot make a neder by linking to something which is usher innately. If you say that this thing is like chazer, a pig, so that doesn't work, because you can't say that it's like something which is innately usher. And this is going to be a big part of the Gemara's back and forth in this discussion here. So let's discuss the question. Again, the question was, if you have two pieces of meat in front of you, somebody has two pieces of meat in front of him, one of them is meat from a carbon shlamim, which is mutter to eat. It's after the full service of the shlamim has happened. There's been shchita, holacha, kabbalah, zrika. The main thing is that the zrika happened, and therefore it's mutter to eat that meat. However, before you did the zrika, it was usher to eat that meat. Now, a person turns to the other piece of meat, which is completely heter, and says, this is like that. This is like that shlamim meat. What does he mean? Does it mean to say it's like the shlamim meat now, and therefore it's heter just like the shlamim meat is now? Or does he mean to say it's like the main factor of shlamim, which is that it's isser? It was isser all along. Until this final zrika step happened, it was isser. So is he referring to the essential concept of a carbon, like a carbon shlamim? And that's what he means when he says that this is like the shlamim? Or does he mean like it is now, and therefore it stays heter? That's Gemara's question. So the Gemara first tries to answer it based on our Mishnah. In our last Mishnah, we saw that an example of something that somebody can do to create an isser is to call it nicer or piggle. Now, piggle we're not going to use here. Piggle is left out of this proof. The Rishonim say it was just brought in here together because it was part of the same phrase. But the main focus is on nicer. Now, what is nicer? Nicer is when a carbon meat is left over after the time in which one is allowed to eat it. That means that this nicer already went through the complete zerika process. It did everything. It left its isser carbon. It became heter to eat, and then it went further and it became nicer. Now, when he says that heter is usher like the nicer, it can't be referring to the isser nicer, because the isser nicer is not usher because of a neder. And like we said in the introduction to this shir, you can only be matvis, you can only make a neder based on linking it to something which is usher because of neder. So he could not have been referring to the isser nicer. He must have been referring to the original status of a carbon, that this animal was originally mukdash as a carbon. And that's a neder that was created. He must have been referring to that. Now, since we're talking about nicer, it's obviously after the Zrikas Adam, so we're talking about exactly our Shiloh. We're talking about a case where it was an animal, there was a carbon, and it went to the status of heter, and now it became heter. The fact that it's nicer now is irrelevant, and he's referring to the original carbon status. And this proves that he does not mean what the status is now. He's referring to the original status before, and it does create an isser. So Gemara answers, you can't prove anything from here, because here we may not be talking about noser of a carbon shlamim. Maybe we're talking about leftover carbon oila. A carbon oila never has any heter, because a carbon oila is never eaten. The concept of nicer exists when it wasn't put on the mizbeach in the proper time frame. So if he's referring to the nicer of a carbon oila, the carbon oila was always usher. That isser ola is something that comes because of a neder. Somebody was menadev this carbon to be a carbon oila, and he's referring to that. So really the halacha might be that, and he says that this meat should be like, that meat is referring to its current status now, not what it was in the beginning. But here we're talking about carbon oila, and its carbon status now is also isser. So Gemara questions, if we're talking about carbon oila, what's the point in talking about nicer? What's the significance of the fact that it's nicer now? It doesn't teach me anything. Carbon oila is always isser, and it always works. The fact that it's nicer now is irrelevant. You should just say, oila meat, talking about meat of a carbon oila. So why did the Mishnah mention a nicer at all? So the Gemara answers there's a chiddush in the fact that it's nicer, because people may get confused and say that if somebody is tries to be matvis in Isser. He wants to say that something is usser, like a nicer of an oila, we may think he means the Isser nicer. He's trying to link it to the Isser nicer, which does not work because that is innately usser nicer. It's usser because of the Torah. It's not usser because of a neder. And therefore, you may think that it doesn't work, even though it's referring to nicer. So the Mishnah is being mechadish to me that even though he mentions nicer, he doesn't mean the Isser nicer. He means the Isser oila, which comes because of a neder, and therefore it is a proper linkage, and it does work. And therefore, we have no proof from this Mishnah to our Shaila, because again, we're talking about Oilamit. We now go on to the next proof that the Gemara brings to this question, which is from a Brisa that says, what is the neder that the Torah asers? And it gives the following example. Somebody says, I am, that I'm not going to eat meat or I'm not going to drink wine, like the day that my father died, or the day my Rebbe died, or the day that Gedaliah ben Achikam died, that's Tzayim Gedaliah, or the day that I first saw Yerushalayim and its Churban. All these days there's a minhag to fast. Today we don't fast on the day of the death of one's father, Rebbe, or when we first see Yerushalayim, but we do fast on Tzom Gedaliah. So this person said, I'm going to be like those days, and that therefore sounds like he's making a neder not to eat on those days, or at least not to eat meat and wine if that was the minhag that he had on those specific days that he mentioned. Now, Shmuel clarifies the case here. Shmuel says the case is that he's on the anniversary of one of those days. So let's say he's on his father's yahrzeit. Let's say his father's yahrzeit was the Tesvav Cheshvan. He's standing on Tesvav Cheshvan, and he says that I'm not going to eat like today, like this day. That's what Shmuel says. Gemara understands, what does it mean? It means that his father died, let's say, 10 years ago on Tesvav Cheshvan. And then the next year, 9 years ago, he made a neder that he's not going to eat because it was his father's yahrzeit. And therefore he made a day of Isser. Then he let it lapse for a while. He didn't keep that tinus from the years that followed. Now he's saying that this is going to be, I'm going to make a neder that I'm not going to eat, just like that day. And he's referring to this day of the calendar year, which is his father's yahrzeit, which he had made an Isser 9 years ago. He had made a fast day 9 years ago. That's what it sounds like Shmuel means to say. Shmuel's his wording is that he's making the neder on that day itself. So obviously referring to that, he made a tinus on that day in the past. So Gemara says, therefore, this is a proof to our Shaila, because in the most recent years, he didn't make any Isser on this day. Way back, he did make an Isser on this day. So you see, therefore, when he refers to this, he tries to be matfis to this, and he says that I'm not going to eat like on this day, he's referring to the original status. Therefore, in our case also of the carbon shlamim, we could also be referring to the original status that it was usser, not referring to the current status that it's a mutter. Shmuel says there's no proof, because it could be what Shmuel meant to say is that he made a fast day and he kept going all the way through. He kept the fast day all the way through all the years, and therefore there never was a time that his father's yahrzeit was ever mutter. It was a fast day straight through. And that's what Shmuel is referring to, and he's saying that he refers to that day, and he makes the neder in that situation. Now, the Gemara Masech Shvus explains what the chiddush is. If he's making an Isser all this time, what's the chiddush? The Gemara there says the chiddush is either that one can make a neder based on Tzom Gedaliah, even though that's an Isser that was created by the Rabbanon, or the Gemara has other answers. You may think that this is not a valid form of making a neder at all, because it's a personal Isser for him. It's not an Isser for anyone else, like a karbanos. That's all in the Sagidir. The Gemara leaves that out over here, and the Gemara concludes that this is not a proof. The Gemara goes on to its next proof. The next proof is from a Brisa discussing somebody who makes a neder by being matvis, whatever he's asering, to truma. So it talks about two types of truma. It talks about challah, which is a piece that we have to take off the dough of chulin to give to the Kain. The Brisa that we're quoting, it calls it chalas arin, because it's challah that's taken off and given to the Kain. And then it says uki trumasai, that is trumas arin, which is the truma that's given to kohanim. Now, the Brisa paskins that both of the things are not valid ways of making a neder, and the reason is because the isser on challah and truma is not an isser that's created by a neder. It's an isser min hashemayim. They're innately usser, even though the person has to identify what's going to be challah and what's going to be truma. He just sets aside which is which, but the isser comes automatically. It's not an isser that he creates. It's not considered to be something that's usser because of the neder. Now, so the Gemara says there's another type of truma that's not mentioned, and that type of truma, obviously, there is a valid neder if one is matvis to that. What truma is that? So Gemara says it's trumas lachmei toida, the breads that go with the carbon toida. Somebody brings a carbon toida, he has to bring 40 loaves of bread. Those 40 loaves of bread are divided into 4 categories, each one baked differently. 10 loaves of each of the 4. The 4 are chametz. You have to have 10 loaves of chametz. You have to have 10 loaves of matzah wafers. You have to have, those are called rikikin. You have to have 10 loaves of matzah breads. That's breads that made into a loaf, but it's not allowed to become chametz. Those are called chalis. And the fourth category is 10 loaves of revucha. That is where the dough is boiled before you bake the dough, and otherwise it's kept as matzah. So therefore you have these 10 loaves of each of these 4 categories for a total of 40 loaves. A trumas toda is where you take one of each set of 10 and give it to kahanim. Now, there, the Brisa is implying again that there's some type of truma that you could be matfis to, which is a valid lashon iser. The Gemara says, what else could it be? It's obviously referring to the truma of the lachmei taida. Now, the truma of the lachmei taida is part of a carbon taida, and the breads become aser along with the carbon taida, creates an iser. They're also like every other carbon, and therefore it's a davar hanoider. It's not a innate isser. It's an isser because of the neder that was made when they were set aside for karbanis. And they only become mutter when the blood of the carbon taida has the zrika, has the sprinkling performed on it. Now, generally, you only set aside one of each group of 10 loaves to give to the kohen once you've already done zrikas adam, because until you could eat it, what's the point in setting it aside? Therefore, lachmei taida by definition only exists after the carbon taida is already mutter, and the lachmei taida are already mutter too. And yet, this mission is implying that if you were to say that you make a neder by being matvis something to lachmei taida, to trumas lachmei taida, that would be good. Aha! So you see that we follow its previous state in which it was usher before the zrikas adam, not the current state in which you find it now at the time that the neder is made. So Gemara says, no, you're making a wrong diak in the brisa. When the brisa implied that there is some other type of truma which you could be matvis to and make an iser, you could make the neder, it was not referring to trumas lachmei taida. It was talking about trumas halishka, and that's the coins, the half shekel coins that are brought and put in the boxes in the Beis Hamikdash to buy karbanos. Those are iser, and that's considered to be a davar hanoider. And they take those coins out in a truma. They take a basket full out. It's called trumas halishka. Therefore, those coins are also called truma. If somebody were to be matfis to those coins, it's counted as a neder, it counts as a davar hanoider, and it's a valid neder. So therefore, you have no diak of this mission at all, anything to do with lachmei taida. So the Gemara says, so what do you want to tell me though? You want to taina that trumas lachmei taida, you cannot make a neder to, because, and the reason would be because, like you're telling me, we would understand the language as referring to the status of the lachmei taida now, not what it was before. So if that's true, so why do you have to mention challah, and why do you have to mention regular truma? Those are a lesser chiddush that they do not work because those aren't even a davar hanoider. Lachmei taida, trumas lachmei taida, the iser there is because it's a davar hanoider, because it's lachmei taida, which is a davar hanoider, part of the carbon taida, and still the truma, the hatfasa to try to make the iser doesn't work. So just tell me that case, and I would know on my own that a lighter case, a case like truma and challah, which is more likely to be no good because there you try to be matris on a davar ha'aser, something which is innately aser, that's not a valid neder. So you shouldn't have to say it. Obviously, the fact that the Mishnah didn't mention just lachmei taida is because lachmei taida is aser, and our diak is really correct. And then we go back to our kasha just like we had before. So Mara gives 2 answers. First of all, the Gemara says we could be referring to, when we say truma, when the Brisa says truma, it could mean truma of lachem teda also. It doesn't just mean regular truma that's given to a kohen from one grain. It could also be referring to truma of the lachem teda, and therefore it is mentioned in the Mishnah, and it's correct. There's no kasha from the fact that we mentioned that. The Gemara's second answer is to give a whole different approach, to erase what we answered up till now, that the diak is really trumas halishka. The Gemara wants to say, no, really, Trumas Lachmei Toida is a valid Isser. You can be matvis a neder. You can be matvis by making a neder to Trumas Lachmei Toida, but we're not talking about Trumas Lachmei Toida after the zrika of the blood of the carbon Toida, when the Lachmei Toida are heter. We're talking about where somebody decided to separate his Lachmei Toida, his Trumas Lachmei Toida, before the zrika, when the breads are still usher to eat because they weren't matir by the Zrikas Adam yet. Even though this is generally not done, it is possible to do it, and that's the case that we're referring to, and therefore he is matvis to lachmei toida, trumas lachmei toida, which remains in its isser, and there's no proof to our question as to what happens when the isser is over. Is he referring to the time of isser, or is he referring to the time of heter? Now, since it could be referring to that, it makes sense for our Mishnah to leave that case out, or for our Brisa to leave that case out, because there are some cases in which the Trumas Lachmei Toida is a valid neder, and therefore I can't mention that it's not, even if it's rare to have those cases. So now the Gemara says, I'm just going to show you another a source of this halacha that you could make Trumas Lachmei Toida even before you separate, even before you do Zrikas Adam, even at the time that it is Aser. Where do you see that? So it's from a statement of Rav Tibi Bar Kisna, the name of Shmuel, who says it's possible for all the lachmei toida in each type to be combined together into one big lechem. All 10 of each type can be put together into one big one, and then you'll only have 4. Now, even though the Torah says to bring 40, that's just the main mitzvah, that's the correct way to do it, but if you have all the 4 types and you mush them together into just 4 very large loaves with the proper size, that would be okay. So Gemara's question is, let's figure this out. What happened to your truma? If you're going to make them all into all the rikikin into one large loaf, and all the revucha, and all the matzah, and all the chalas into one large loaf, how are you going to take truma off? Now, don't tell me you'll take one whole one, truma on the other ones, because the Torah says you can't do that. You need truma from each of them. It says, v'hikr mimenu echad mikol carbon. Don't tell me you'll break off a piece, because you can't give a broken piece. You have to give a whole one. It says echad, which refers to a whole challah. So what are you supposed to do? So what must be, the only way to accomplish this is as follows. You take the truma off while it's still the dough. That means you have 40 loaves in the dough state before you bake it. Then you take one of each group of 10 and you make it truma just like usual. Even though it's still dough, you can do that. Then once the truma is already separated, you combine each type into a big ball and make a big challah, a big loaf out of each of them. So you could do that. Now, from this statement is clear that it's possible to take truma while the dough are unbaked. Now, Zrikas Adam can only be done after the baking. So if you're taking truma while the dough is not baked yet, it's obviously before Zrikas Adam. So you see, you could do hafrashas truma before the zrika, and therefore that could be our answer. Our question we're talking about was for the zrika, and therefore there's no proof to anything. This brisa could be talking about when there was no status of iser, there was no status of heter, there was only iser, and there's no proof to our question at all. The Gemara now wants to say that maybe this whole question is dependent on the Machlokes Tanaim. We have a Machlokes Tanaim between Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Yehuda in the case of somebody who wants to be matfis to a Bukhar. He says this should be also like a Bukhar. Bukhar, of course, is the firstborn that's given to a kohen, and it's brought as a carbon, and therefore it's Isser until Zrikas Adam. So there's Machlokes of Yaakov and Rabbi Yehuda if it works or not. So the Gemara says, what's this Machlokes? If we're talking about before Zrikas Adam, then for sure it should be Isser. He was matfis to something which is complete Isser. If it's talking about after Zrikas Adam, what's the question? If he said it should be like this Bechar, which is Heter, so what's the issue? Must be talking about our case, where he had the Bechar after Zrikas Adam, and he said this should be like that, and we're not clear if he means like that before Zrika, or like that after Zrika, if it means now or if it means before. So you see, it's exactly Machlokes over our issue. Someone says, no, it's not the Machlokes. Machlokes is where you're talking about before Zrikas Adam, where it's really Asr, and the Machlokes is this is really a davar this is something which is really aser. Bechor is not a davar hanoider, it's a davar ha'aser, something which is innately aser. And the machlokes is there a hatfasa on a davar ha'aser? We've been assuming up to now that there isn't, but actually Rabbi Yaakov holds there is. Rabbi Yehuda holds there's not. And the Gemara is going to show their sources and what their machlokes is over on the next daf.